it goes on down, you know, it talks about the women who worked hard and worked very hard and all of those things, which I think is very interesting. But I want us to go up and study about Phoebe, okay? In the first 2 verses there, we learn a lot. So I want us to kind of dissect that and look into it. You know, Phoebe, at first, basically, Paul, when he writes this, he says that he calls her a servant, and then he says she was a great help to many people, is the way a lot of your versions read. Now, the word that is for Phoebe, a servant, okay, is diakonos. And some of you have heard us talk about this some before, the diakonos. And that is the word that is translated deacon, okay? But it is also translated a lot of other ways, but very often and most often as a minister of the word, a servant of the word. So even what we call deacon, I think we need to restudy, honestly, because this concept of, well, let's look at all the places, okay? Paul uses this exact term, okay, that he has called now Phoebe. He uses it in 1 Corinthians 3:5. He refers to himself as diakonos, that's what he is. He calls himself this again in 2 Corinthians 3:6, in chapter 6, verse 4, and in chapter 11, verse 23. He calls himself diakonos in Ephesians 3:7 and in Colossians 1:23 and 25, I believe is the reference. So, but he's called himself this over and over, this term that he called Phoebe, okay? And it's diakonos. But when it's translated for the guys, he also calls, he also calls Tychicus, okay, one of the other preachers, you remember? In Ephesians 6:21 and Colossians 4:7, he calls Tychicus a diakonos. He calls Epaphras a diakonos in Colossians 1:7. And then, this is one you'll know if you do recognize those guys, Timothy. He called Timothy diakonos in 1 Thessalonians 3 and in 1 Timothy 4. And so it was a term that he used for himself for the ones that we know of that were traveling preachers or evangelists. And I think it's good for us to understand that this word that he used for Phoebe is something that when it was translated for her, they just said servant, because it was a woman. And so it was this kind of like, well, how is she? But now some of your versions do, they've got a footnote that says deaconess, right? Because they've gotten that far, okay, with accepting that is what Paul actually said of her. So he's saying, I commend to you our sister that is a diakonos of the church in Cenchrea. So I think it's worth studying. I think we need to dig that out. You guys, like hopefully I will whet your appetite and we'll go back and look and see, because this is interesting that she is a minister of the word, or a servant of the word, of the church in Cenchrea. And then he says, I ask you to receive her in the Lord and worthy of the saints. Give her any help she may need, for she has been a great help. Now that word actually is prostatus. Okay, now it was translated a great help. It's kind of like, reminds me of Azer, and that you guys would have all studied, right, about Azer in Genesis, and Genesis 2, and when God made woman, and it was translated helper. But then we learned a lot about that word, right, that what helper really means. And but this is, it's like it says she was a prostatus to many people, including me. Now that word is something that I think is really important. It's like when you look at that word, it's a noun, but the word in verb form, it's like saying lead, someone will lead or they're a leader. Okay, it's that kind of. And I wanted us to look at prostemi, the way Paul uses this word even in the rest of Romans, okay, the way he uses this concept and this word. But before I go there, just the word prostatus, it's in the government, the way they use this term governmentally in Rome at that time had to do with a leader, a democratic leader, had to do with someone that would sort of lead the people, help the people, represent the people, teach the people. So this was a word that was used even in the world at that time, okay, and meant something specific, and then prostemi, okay, the sort of the noun, and then now the action of that person, what it would mean. It's used 8 times by Paul himself, okay? In his writing, he uses it here, and he uses it 8 times. I want us to look, especially in Romans 12. If you'll turn back just a couple of pages, because remember, this is a letter. It's a letter from Paul to the church in Rome. And we always need to remember this, because sometimes I think that we forget that it's like reading somebody's email, but you don't get both parts of the conversation. You just get one side of the conversation. So it wasn't written to us, but we can learn so much about it. We're looking for those enduring principles. Very often Paul taught us how to think, not what to think. Remember? And it's good that he taught us what to think on some things, but a lot of the time he's teaching us how to think. And so we have to look for those enduring principles. But in Romans chapter 12, in verses 6 through 8, I don't think we want to read, well, maybe we want to start up a little bit. Let's start in verse 4. Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts. And we have different gifts according to the grace given us. If a person's gift is prophesying, let them use it in proportion to their faith. If it is serving, let them serve. If it is teaching, let them teach. If it is encouraging, let them encourage. If it is contributing to the needs of others, let them give generously. If it is leadership, let them lead diligently. If it is showing mercy, let them do it cheerfully. Now, the word that we're looking at is there in verse 8, where it says, if it is leadership, let them lead gently. That is the word. It's that we're looking for. And when it's used there, I think it's pretty clear he's talking about a gift that was given. And evidently, Phoebe had that gift. She benefited many, many people, Paul says, including himself, by using her gift, and using this gift that she'd been given. But it's also in 1 Thessalonians 5, and 1 Timothy 3, 1 Thessalonians 5:12, 1 Timothy 3, 4 and 5. 1 Timothy 3:12, and there's several others, but it's have charge over you, have lead of you, to manage or to rule or to manage, to rule or take lead. That's the way this is translated in these other places. And so, but here with her it says she was a great help, which I believe she was a great help, but it's a bigger word than that. And I think it's good for us to acknowledge, and understand that. But also this idea of having the person carry a letter. There wasn't a UPS, there was no FedEx, there was no US mail. If you wanted to write a letter to someone, then you had to get a courier. You had to get someone to take it. But a letter is important as Romans. Okay, now think about how much we value the book of Romans, what all we've learned, and we have because of the book of Romans. In fact, it's considered one of the meatiest, theologically rich books in the entire Bible. So Paul's sending this letter, this important letter with all these deep, important concepts, and he sends it with Phoebe. And you say, well, yeah, but she's just like the mailman. That's not how they did it. She was to carry it with her, as far as you read in history, how they did letters. And then she's to vouch for it. Okay? She's got to be so trustworthy that she's like, this is really from Paul. Okay? You can trust me, you can believe it. And then she's supposed to present it, usually. Usually whoever brings the letter, they are a presenter. They present it. So she would go before the church and she would like read it to them. And if they have questions, she's supposed to be able to answer sort of what's happening because of that or what this may mean. You see what I mean? It's like it's a bigger responsibility than sometimes we think of as just yeah, she brought the letter. But it was important to them, a place. And that's the reason, and they probably already knew her, is the truth. But even at the end of the letter, he adds in sort of who she is and to remember and how to treat her now that she's there and she's brought you this is how you respond. Give her what she needs, treat her this way. And which I just really, I love that. That she can explain it, she can help with it. You know, I do think that Paul really did work with women. And that's the thing, that when I started looking, it's like Jesus, you know, we talked about Jesus and women the last month. And it was beautiful to study and restudy about Jesus and how he walked and talked with women and traveled with them. But then to watch in Paul's ministry, how he imitated it, how he put it into practice, how he really valued the women that were co-working with him in the ministry, and that he treated and taught to them very similarly that he did to the men that he worked with as well. I don't think there were as many women as men leading, especially in the world at that time. But I do believe that this opens up a lot for us to look at, to study, to really rethink how we've done things. Paul's here somewhere. I don't know where he is exactly, you know, heaven or whatever. But I think sometimes he's probably in that cloud of witnesses, you know, he's probably looking down saying, no, what in the world? Why do you have a bad attitude toward me? You know, and not that disciples do, but that just in general, I think it has been misunderstood. That instead, he actually was a champion of women. He just looked at he didn't care whether they were women or men. And he doesn't describe them unless there's a relationship of some sort as somebody's husband or somebody's daughter or somebody's wife or somebody's daughter. Or he doesn't describe them that way unless it kind of is part of the story and how he knows them. Which is different for that day and time too. It's not that identity. It's the same as Jesus. And I think that I think that probably we do, you know, we need to make sure that people understand that he was a champion of women. And that once we get a few little things straight, and we understand what he wasn't saying in some places and what he was saying, and we've already studied 1 Timothy 2, we've already studied Ephesians 5, and Colossians 3, and those passages. But once we get a hold of it, we see that he was amazing. So, wherever he is, I hope he knows that we really, really appreciate his mutuality and how he treated everybody the same and with love and used everyone's gifts and just wanted everybody to use everything they had to further the gospel. Thank you.
Bear with me just a couple more moments. I do have some closing comments to make. Where are we really going with this? You know, we've had some opportunities recently to have this conversation with larger and larger groups. In some ways with larger groups across the country, larger groups in our particular region. And one of the encouraging things to me is even when people don't agree 100%, we are having a good conversation about this. And that's not just trying to put a nice spin on it. That's the way that I wish disciples could act in everything. Sometimes we have a view that the first century church was very homogeneous, and it wasn't. It clearly wasn't. There was a strong difference between the church that was made up of more previously Orthodox Jewish Hebrew people than there was between the Gentile churches. There was such a distinction between those churches, they had to have a special meeting to try to get some sort of unity over what are going to be just the basic things we agree on. And that letter that was sent out from Jerusalem on that particular occasion was such a limited number of things because, now, what I just said is a fact. Now I'm editorializing. I think it's because it's hard for us to agree on so many things. It's just not possible. I think that sometimes we'd like to have a more homogeneous view of what the first century church was and all the things that they had figured out. Lisa and I are two different. We're one, we're married, we're partners, we agree on so many things, but we're two different people.
Yeah.
We have different priorities at times. Where we overlap and share, that's really nice. Yeah, that's really sweet. There are some things that matter to her more than me, but because it matters to her, I try to care. There's some things that don't matter to me. Unity is a big deal to me. But I've realized for years and years and years, since we disagree on so many things, then we need to find the common denominators and what we can agree on. On this subject, and the reason why I want to contrast it or compare it or go back 2,000 years ago is with this subject, in the realm of unity, we don't have a new problem. We don't have a new problem where people who love each other or love the Lord see things differently and what in the world are we going to do. One of the most encouraging things that come out of conversations recently that we've had is that people seem to tend to agree if we all believe in baptizing folks into Jesus Christ, then the main thing we need to do is let people know if you're going to a fellowship that views things a little differently than how we view them, you need to submit to the leadership there. It certainly is something good to talk about if folks want to talk about it there. But more than anything, we need to be harmonious and not divisive or disruptive. One of the things that I'm hoping to, this isn't, we have catchphrases these days, and sometimes saying, well, let's start a conversation. That's just sort of a nice, really the fact is people disagree on these things. And very often when you disagree, you want people to agree with what you think. On this particular subject, it would be really great if we could get to some absolute truth, but that's probably not going to happen. Because for years and years and years, and I say that because for years and years, we thought we had absolute truth. And in our absolute truth, there was a hierarchy, there was patriarchy, there were things that it was such an absolute truth that if you became part of our fellowship, and you were a woman especially, part of becoming part of our fellowship was if you did not view patriarchy as a desirable thing, for you to be in our fellowship, you had to change your mind. You had to submit to it. That was one of the rules, and that's how it worked. And now, with a lot of the things that we're talking about, it can be confusing or misunderstood. I don't want, there's a fairly short list of things that I think is really clear for me as a leader in a congregation to not try to act like I'm trying to surprise people or cover. I believe that if you've got a small group in some part of town and it's a co-ed group of people, and there is a woman who is more qualified, been a disciple longer, more knowledgeable in the scriptures, I don't just think it's okay, I think it's better if she leads that group. I don't think it's necessary for us to go and find a man that we've got to import over there, export and put over there. I think it's fine. I don't think it is making a concession or, gee, we don't have a... but now that's because I have changed my view from Genesis to Revelation of this relationship between men and women. I don't believe that Deborah was a concession on the Lord. Well, we don't have a man that can be a judge, so let's let a woman do it. And that's how weak Israel was. They couldn't find... I believe that we have to come to the Bible with a preconception that men are elevated over women in order to draw some of the conclusions we've drawn for years and years about patriarchy and hierarchy. Let me give you an example. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 32, it says, "Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it." Now this is very all-inclusive language. I'm not a Greek scholar. I can look things up, but it's pretty easy to do your own research on this and see that this is men and women. You are the body of Christ. Each one of you is a part of it. And in the church, God has appointed, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then workers of miracles, also those having gifts of healing, those able to help others, those with gifts of administration, and those speaking in different kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? These are rhetorical questions. Are all apostles? No. Not everyone has the same gifts. But he's setting this up. He's saying, do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? But eagerly desire the greater gifts. And now I'll show you the most excellent way. And he's going to give us our favorite chapter in all of us romantics, right? At least he's going to go on and talk about love. But in this paragraph where he's talking about these in the body of Christ, we're a part of it, and how God's appointed people, whether you want to call them roles, gifts, whatever, there's in the language, there's nothing to discriminate male or female, unless we have a prejudice that all of these roles automatically are roles for men. Now go over to Acts chapter 21 quickly. And in verse 7, we're coming into the middle of Paul's trip trying to make his way to Jerusalem. But as he's voyaging, he's going to come to Tyre, and he lands at Ptolemais, where we greeted the brothers and stayed with them for a day. This is Acts 21:7. And in verse 8, leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Now this is the same word. This is a connection with what Paul says in Corinthians when he's talking about members of the body and people prophesying. This isn't some new special category, for this Philip's 4 daughters. You follow what I'm saying? In 1 Corinthians, you see Paul saying, this is the way the body works. And over here in Acts chapter 21, you see an example of some people doing that. Only if you have, and I'm not, I don't want to have see, I've got the microphone, so let me stop right there and say these are debatable things. But I want to be clear why I changed my mind. Because you can read books, this information is out there written by people way more scholarly. And though Lisa has spent 7 years on this subject, there are people who have spent their lives on this subject. And they speak biblical languages. They speak Hebrew and Greek. And they can tell you about the nuances of how words are used. But one of the reasons I would change my mind is because I would argue only if you come to the Scriptures with a predetermined view that men automatically had a position different from women, are you going to be stuck with a problem in Acts 21? Because believe you me, if you have a very legalistic view of a homogeneous church 2,000 years ago, where things were absolutely only men could do this and women couldn't, then you have a problem in Acts 21. You have a problem with the man who was one of the original pillars of the church in Jerusalem, Philip. The book of Acts, as a drama, has, other than Jesus, once it gets started, it has 4 main characters. One of them is killed early, Stephen. The other is Philip. The other 2 are Peter and Paul. Those are the 4 main dynamic male characters in the Bible. It's very interesting. Where were the Marys? Where were the Junias? Where were all of these people? But when you read this, you've got one of the main characters in the book of Acts had 4 daughters who prophesied, which is one of the gifts, which is one of the talent, one of the whatever we want to call it, that Paul says is part of the body. And so one of the reasons why I changed my mind is it's not just liberating because it feels good. It's not just I get to like women or it's nothing like that. It's scriptures that have dogged me my entire life. And as an amateur biblical student for nearly 60 years, there have been passages that my thought bubbles have been glaring with teachers and professors and people. But then when you get in a role of leadership in a group that has a very specific idea and does have a desire to be very homogeneous, then there's a lot of these passages that we either overlook or we try to explain away or we make up some really poor theology. And so the scariest thing about what we're doing, the scariest thing, is we are elevating women to equality with men. But I want to share one little story and then close. One of my best friends who has, and we're on opposite ends of the spectrum on this subject, but one of the reasons is because he has counseled and seen so many women who have been hurt because of pressures they felt being called on to be leaders in the ministry. And I know that to be true. I know over our years in our fellowship, there were so many women that were hurt by the pressures of the ministry. And let me be clear, that was in years when the pressure of ministry on a woman was to lead a ministry of women. Okay? That's the way we did it. And we made that up. And it was, and I think God let us make that up, but we'll save that discussion for another time. And he says, well, for you to talk about women having gifts or abilities equal to men in roles of leadership or things like, he said, I think it's wrong because I've seen women hurt. And my response was, well, I've seen men hurt.
Yeah.
And if we were to quantify it, because we've got more women in the church than we have men, statistically. That's just a mathematical fact. We probably, I haven't looked at any stats in years and years, but I know in the old days we clearly had more men in the full-time ministry than we did women. And I would argue, from that fact alone, we probably hurt more men enlisting them in pressured roles of leadership. And so what is your point, Steve? My point is there are people who are built for leadership, and there are people who are not built for leadership.
Yeah.
Just like 2,000 years ago, there were people who were built for apostles, prophets, and teachers, and whatever. The scariest, there is no other shoe to drop. There's a lot of things that we think that we may never teach out loud in our lives, as far as what does it mean about men and women in God's sight? What can we do? I think there's a lot of things for unity's sake, and in our fellowship, there's a lot of things that I may not see in my day. I don't know where the Lord's going to take any of this. But I know right now we've seen and experienced 99% of what we're talking about. We're talking about in an assembly a sister has as much right to stand up and address the congregation without a man giving her permission. Now, I'm not talking about, there's always authorities that plan out the schedule. I'm talking about, we've had this thing, well, if the brother was standing next to her, and now here's my pretty wife, and she's going to share a word, or here's this lovely sister, she's going to share a word. We believe that men and women can speak in the assembly. We believe that women in situations where they are the most qualified to lead, we believe if we have a Korea who is one of the most qualified singers we've got, we don't have to have a brother stand up and say, turn your songbooks to page whatever, and then Korea stands up to the mic. We don't, and we've done things like that for years that we just sort of made up and couldn't explain why we're doing it. This is the explanation for why we're doing what we're doing, because we believe the scriptures paint a picture of a different kind of church than what many of us have experienced. Now, for those of us that have been in this for years and years, I think what we've done has been wonderful, and God has blessed us. And growing up where I grew up, we were light years ahead of so many people. I don't want to be so critical of us.
Right.
That's critical of me. I just want to say there is a way in which I have changed my mind, and that's what I've been repeating over and over. We are more than anything, we feel obligated to explain to people why we've changed our minds and what we've changed our minds about. And if it's scary, I want to be really clear that okay, here's what you should be scared of.
Yeah.
We believe it's okay. This is a mixed group of people. The camera can't see everybody. We have men and women here. And Lisa just stood up and opened the scriptures and shared something that I think is very meaningful to everybody. We believe that's okay.
Yeah.
And we believe it's okay because we think that is something that the Lord did, that the Apostle Paul, that they instituted 2,000 years ago. And we believe that there are scriptures that have been problematic for people who don't view it this way, that just aren't problems for us anymore. In fact, now they make sense. So, anyway, thank you for your attention. Thanks for being here tonight. It's good to see everybody. God bless. That's it. We're over.